Okay, awesome. Thank you, Margarita, and thank you for the invitation. It's good to be here. All right, so Hong Jing has just described this new approach to analogical mapping called Probabilistic Analogical Mapping, or PAM. And what I'm going to do is to tell you about some of our recent work to try to extend this model to visual analogy problems such as Raven's progressive matrices. So this is really a new project, still very much in its early stages. But I think it's already resulted in some interesting developments and extensions being made to the model, which I think suggests some broader implications about analogical reasoning. So I have here an image from the classic Raven's progressive matrices problem sets. I'm sure I don't have to say too much to this audience about what Raven's matrices are, but just briefly, the idea is this is a classic visual problem solving test set where you get problems composed of geometric figures in a 3x3 matrix format. And the task is to figure out the abstract pattern or set of patterns that governs the problem, and then use that to fill in the blank and complete the pattern. And these were, of course, developed as a test of fluid intelligence or the ability to reason about and solve novel problems. And they're still really considered one of the best tests of that capacity. So just a bit of background about the work that's been done so far on modeling these kinds of problems. So one recent line of work comes from the deep learning world, where there's been a recent interest in the question of whether neural networks can solve these sorts of problems. So of course, deep learning is generally very data hungry. So in order to get deep learning algorithms that can solve RPM problems, one needs data sets consisting of a pretty significant number of these kinds of problems. And so that's led to the development of these two benchmark data sets. So one is the programmatically generated matrices, or PGM, that was put out by DeepMind a few years ago. And the other is the Raven data set that comes from a group here at UCLA. And these both basically contain a very large number of automatically generated problems based on the same kinds of relations and rules that are found in the actual RPM problems. And so one interesting result that's come out of that line of work is the finding that even with a massive amount of training experience, it's actually not so easy to build deep learning algorithms that can perform well on these problems. And so this has led to the development of a number of architectures with interesting inductive biases that are well suited to these sorts of problems. And so here I have just one example. This one's called the scattering compositional learner. And basically, this model uses an interesting form of parameter sharing to accomplish a kind of compositionality and manages to perform quite well on both of the existing data sets. But of course, the major caveat is that in order to achieve that level of performance, these sorts of models really require a massive amount of training directly on RPM problems. And I think this arguably turns the problem into a kind of detection of a familiar set of rules rather than the test of fluid reasoning that it was originally intended to be. And so I think there's a good argument that this entire framing is incorrect, and that really humans don't learn to solve analogies through extensive training, but instead the ability to make analogies is perhaps more like a core capacity that we use to make sense of novel problems in unfamiliar situations. And I think that perspective suggests that it might be therefore useful to build innate machinery for performing analogies into, for instance, deep learning systems. And that's the hypothesis that motivates the approach we've taken here. So of course, long before the advent of deep learning and massive data sets, analogy researchers were already pursuing this hypothesis and building computational models of the analogical reasoning process. And one of the original such models, the structure mapping engine, has actually recently been applied to solve almost the entirety of the standard progressive matrices, which is one of the RPM problem sets. And so I think it's worth just briefly giving a hint of what I see as the relationship between that approach and the one that we've been developing. So basically, the structure mapping approach, along with virtually every model of analogical reasoning in cognitive science, treats the process of analogical mapping as a kind of representation matching. So the idea is you're presented with a representation of two situations, for instance, the solar system and the atom. And what you have to do is align or find mappings between the elements of those two situations. And so at that level, I think our approach is basically similar. The major difference is the kind of representations that are being matched. Namely, the structure mapping approach relies on symbolic representations, whereas our approach relies on distributed vector representations. And so we aren't at the point yet where we've really done a head-to-head test of these two approaches, but I do think there are a few high-level reasons for thinking that it's worthwhile to explore an approach that's based on distributed vector representations. So the first is that, as I already mentioned, these are exactly the sorts of representations that one typically finds in deep learning systems. And I think since it's deep learning systems that have so far shown the most success in interacting directly with high-dimensional real-world data, I think it's worth pursuing an approach to analogical reasoning that can operate directly on those kinds of representations. The second is, I think, a point that's been appreciated in cognitive science for a long time, which is basically that it's very difficult to capture the subtle graded meaning of real-world concepts using atomic elements like symbols. And distributed representations, by contrast, I think are naturally very good at doing this. And then the third point I want to make is less about the representations and more about the actual optimization process that we're using. So basically, I think that gradient descent-based optimization procedures of the sort that are also ubiquitous in deep learning are ultimately going to provide a much more powerful reasoning mechanism that I think will be better equipped to handle the combinatorial complexity that results from trying to align very high dimensional concepts. And so that's all more or less by way of hypothesis, but those are some of the reasons that have motivated us to take this approach. And then just finally, the last thing I want to note before describing the model is that there's been a recent effort in the deep learning world towards using neural networks to learn attributed graph representations from pixel level inputs. And so an attributed graph is basically a graph that has vectors associated with its nodes and edges. And you can imagine, for instance, representing a visual scene such as this one, where the nodes correspond to the objects in the scene and the edges correspond to the relations between those objects. And our approach basically adopts this representational format. And so I think it's broadly synergistic with the ongoing efforts to develop algorithms that can effectively extract these kinds of representations. Okay, so our model basically has two stages. In the first stage, we use neural networks to learn attributed graph representations directly from pixel level inputs. And then in the second stage, we're going to use a kind of gradient descent optimization procedure to perform alignment between those representations, and then use that to extract a common abstract pattern from a set of examples represented as attributed graphs. Okay, so first, the representation learning. The model uses neural network components to extract vectors that represent both metric attributes and relations, such as brightness or size, and also categorical attributes and relations, namely shape. And we treat these two things differently. So for metric features and relations, we train the model using a relational objective. So basically what we do is we give the model two objects represented as images and ask the model to determine whether one is larger than the other, brighter than the other, and so on. And by setting up the model with a few key inductive biases, we can naturally extract from this both a representation of the metric relations, which tell us, for instance, how much larger one object is than the other, and also the metric attributes, which tell us, for instance, how large an object is on its own. And so just to clarify, the metric relations and the metric attributes are not a source of supervision. These are representations that just emerge as sort of hidden representations in between the image and this simple binary source of supervision. And then for shape, we train the model to first discriminate shapes using just a standard classification loss. And then we can simply use the cosine similarity as a measure of whether these two shapes are the same or different. Okay, so then putting all these components together, we get for each object a representation of its attributes, and for each pair of objects, a representation of the relations between those objects. And so then, using these components, you can essentially take a matrix problem such as this one and get a graph representation for each of the rows where the nodes of the graph have vectors representing each object in the row, and the edges have vectors representing each of the relations between those objects. And the question then is, how are we going to map between these representations? And additionally, how are we going to generate a prediction for this missing node, which represents the blank cell. So it's easiest to describe the mapping first just in terms of a pair of rows. Again, as Hongjing described, we're going to represent a mapping between a pair of rows using a matrix where the elements along the first dimension of the matrix correspond to the nodes or objects in the first row, and the elements along the second dimension of the matrix correspond to the nodes or objects in the second row. And so for instance, the strength of the mapping between these 2 points would correspond to this entry in the matrix, and the strength of the mapping between these 2 points would correspond to this entry in the matrix, and so on. And we're going to optimize this matrix according to the following objectives. So first, we have a measure of the similarity between each pair of objects, A and B, which is based on the Euclidean distance between the vectors representing those objects. Then we have a measure of the overall similarity of the objects that are mapped to each other. And you get this basically by multiplying these pairwise similarity measures by the corresponding mapping strengths. And then similarly, we have a measure of the overall similarity of the mapped relations. Again, this is generated by multiplying the similarity scores by their corresponding mapping strengths. And so from this, you get these 2 graph matching scores, one based on object similarity, GO, and one based on relation similarity, GR. And then finally, the object similarity measures and relation similarity measures are combined together by using this parameter alpha to interpolate between them. So alpha is basically a parameter in the range 0 to 1. And when it's 1, the model is driven only by the similarity of objects. And when it's 0, the model is driven only by the similarity between relations. And one of the interesting aspects of this model, I think, is that it has a kind of global relation mapping versus object mapping mode, which is controlled by this alpha parameter. And as we'll see, which mode the model is in depends on the demands of the problem that it's trying to solve. And then to identify a good mapping, what we're going to do is use this overall graph matching score G as part of a loss function, which we can then just hand over to a generic optimizer in order to optimize both the mapping matrices and the alpha parameter. And then additionally, we also have these 2 regularization terms, which I can explain in more detail if anyone is interested, but basically they encourage the model to discover one-to-one or isomorphic mappings. Okay, so now the question is, how are we going to extend this procedure for mapping between a pair of analogs to Raven's matrix problem that has 3 separate analogs? One way that you could do this might be to optimize 3 separate mappings between each pair of rows, but this really isn't ideal for a couple of reasons. And so the first reason is we want the mappings that the model discovers to be transitive. That is, if the model maps these cells together and these cells together, one second, the slide's not changing. There we go. So if the model maps these cells together and it maps these cells together, the model should ideally also map these cells together. And using these parallel independent mapping processes isn't going to enforce that constraint. And then also, with this approach, it's not clear how you're going to extract any kind of common pattern that governs all 3 of the rows. And that seems kind of like an important part of solving these kinds of problems. And so the approach we've taken instead is to treat the process of solving a Raven's matrix problem as a kind of within problem schema induction, where the objective is to identify a common schema representation and also mappings between this representation and each of the rows. And so if all goes well, this schema is going to represent the abstract pattern that's common across the rows. The way we've done this is actually to define the nodes and edges of this schema as just another set of parameters to be optimized in the service of the graph matching objective. And then taking this a step further, we also actually treat the missing node that needs to be inferred as yet another parameter to be optimized. And so one possibility is you can try and optimize all of these things in parallel, but doing this in a purely parallel manner doesn't work very well for reasons that I can go into if anyone's interested. So instead what we do is we have a 3-stage procedure. So first we map rows 1 and 2. And Then we initialize the schema using a weighted average of rows 1 and 2, weighted by that mapping. And so that establishes a kind of reasonable first guess at the schema. And then we optimize the mappings between each of the 3 rows in the schema representation, while also continuing to fine-tune the schema itself. And then finally, we introduce the missing cell that needs to be inferred to the optimization process, again, while we continue to optimize the other parameters as well. And one interesting finding here is that these 2 initial stages don't actually need to last very long. The optimization procedure can mostly unfold in this 3rd step. So in other words, the introduction of this inference component in the 3rd stage does actually shape the solution that the model comes up with. So there's a significant degree of parallel constraint satisfaction between these 3 processes of mapping, schema, induction, and inference. I think that's one of the things that sets this model apart. Okay, so I'm basically going to go through a few example problems to show how the model works. I have here an animation that depicts the optimization process for a simple problem involving a shape constant along columns. And you can see from this the 3 stages. So first, the mapping begins to develop between rows 1 and 2. And then the mapping between rows 2 and 3 is introduced. So note that the mappings are not actually between the rows, they're between the rows in the schema, but it's easy to work out what the mappings between rows are for the purposes of visualization. And then in the 3rd step, you see that the inference component is introduced and the model gradually generates a predicted answer for the problem. So that prediction is actually in the model's vector space, not an image space, but it's easy there too to train a neural network decoder to visualize the process of generating that prediction in image space. And then finally, you can see the evolution of the alpha parameter with these dashed lines demarcating the 3 stages. And you can see that eventually the model converges to a solution based on mapping objects, which makes sense for this particular problem. And one thing I want to note here is that the mapping matrices really have barely departed from their initial state by the time you get to the 3rd stage. So most of the optimization process is actually unfolding in parallel with the schema induction, inference, and mapping all talking to each other. And then what you can do is you can take the model's predicted answer, either in vector space or image space, and compare it to a set of answer choices. And you can use that to select from among those choices. And so this is just showing the result of doing that using similarity in vector space. When you do that, the model selects the correct answer with very high confidence. So here's another example. This one is a distribution of 3 rule governing the brightness of shapes. So the rule is there are 3 brightness values that are going to appear once in each row, but the order doesn't matter. And in this case, the model again correctly discovers the right mapping. So it maps objects based on their brightness here. And it goes into object mapping mode to do so, which again makes sense for this problem. And it's also able to generate the right answer. Okay, so here's a somewhat more difficult problem because this one involves a combination of multiple rules. So this one has a constant relation on shape and a progression on size. And this is a case where the model settles into a relation mapping mode, which again makes sense for this particular problem. Okay, so this one is interesting because it really shows, I think, how the different optimization procedures interact in a parallel manner. So you can see that the model is initially sort of heading toward a solution based on object mapping. But once the inference component is introduced, it sort of changes course and switches to relation mapping. You can also see that the predicted answer, the inferred cell here, starts out at an intermediate level of brightness because it's an object mapping mode and it's essentially trying to match the 2 triangles that it's mapped to. But then once the model settles into a relational mapping mode, the model eventually settles on the correct answer, which is a brighter triangle. Okay, so this one is a more difficult kind of problem. And what's going on here is that you have 2 different distribution of 3 rules, one for brightness and one for shape. And importantly, you need to establish different incompatible mappings to identify the correct rule for each feature dimension. And so it's actually not possible to solve this sort of problem using only the approach that I've described so far. And basically what you need to do is you need to use some kind of attention. So you can focus only on brightness, for instance, solve that aspect of the problem, and then focus on shape, solve that aspect of the problem, and then eventually combine those together to generate an integrated answer. So essentially what we're going to do is, first, we're going to have the model try to solve a problem, given the processes I've already described. And if that doesn't work very well, in other words, if the resulting graph matching score is sufficiently low, what we're going to do instead is generate separate solutions for each dimension independently. And furthermore, you can actually filter the dimensions based on the overall variance. So in this case, it's easy to determine that only shape and brightness vary, and the prediction of the other dimensions can just be based on the average value for that dimension. And so this works quite well. So you can see here when focusing on brightness, the model maps objects based on brightness. When focusing on shape, the model maps objects based on their shape. And in the case of shape, you can see another one of these cases where the introduction of the inference components, again, changes the course of the solution that the model converges to, such that it eventually converges to an object-based mapping solution. And then ultimately, you can combine the predictions together from the brightness and shape dimension, basically by adding their associated vectors. And from that, you get a final prediction that combines the correct shape and brightness. And that's indeed the correct answer. Okay, so what conclusions can we draw from this? So first, I think we have here kind of a proof of principle that this probabilistic approach to analogical mapping can be used to solve these kinds of novel problems, and it can do so from pixel level inputs. Second, I think this extended version of the model shows that the continuous gradient descent-based framework makes it relatively easy to add additional parameters and components to the optimization process, and can allow all of those components to interact in a somewhat parallel manner, all in the service of this graph matching objective. So one example of that is the inclusion of this alpha parameter, which allows the model to flexibly discover whether a problem is best viewed in terms of objects or relations, rather than the modeler having to set that parameter themselves. But even though the model does have a significant degree of parallelism and crosstalk between these different optimization processes, I think we've actually already identified a few ways in which the processing seems to really need to be sequential. And one of those is this three-stage approach that allows the first two stages to establish good initial conditions for the third, more parallel stage. And another is from these problems that involve multiple incompatible solutions for different elements of the problem, necessitating a kind of sequential attention to each future dimension. And I think both of these are interesting cases because a standard view for why the brain solves problems of this sort sequentially is that there are basically working memory limitations that prevent too many elements from being considered in parallel. But that's not a limitation that this model faces. So I think an interesting alternative possibility or additional possibility is that there are perhaps deeper computational or algorithmic reasons why sequential processing is necessary beyond just a mere implementational constraint. And then the final conclusion that I want to draw from these results is that I think it's possible to see the discovery of abstract rules that goes on when solving problems like Raven's matrices as a kind of within problem schema induction. And I think that might be a promising way to think about the process of inducing abstract rules or abstract patterns in general. And then in terms of future directions, obviously, as I said, this project is still in its early stages, so there's still quite a lot for us to do. One important next step, just going back to this initial problem that I showed on the first slide, obviously solving problems like this is going to require the ability to parse an image into separate objects. And there are, as I mentioned, a number of recently developed techniques for doing so, many of which work quite well. And that's also, there's a lot of ongoing development in that area. So that's something that I'm looking forward to incorporating into the model. And then finally, I think there's one important issue which I haven't touched on much, but which looms large in the analogy literature in general, and that's the issue of re-representation. So basically, you know, a lot of what goes on when solving difficult analogy problems is not only mapping between some set of representations, but actually altering those representations themselves in some way so as to achieve a better mapping. And I think this is something that actually fits quite naturally into our framework. I think we've seen it a little bit already in the problems that require sequential attention to different dimensions. So you can think about the process of, you know, attending to shape and ignoring brightness as actually altering the representation in a way, you know, in the service of the downstream mapping objective. And I think we can probably push that even further and introduce other re-representational capacities. So you could, for instance, attend to certain objects and ignore others. You could group similar objects together and represent them with a single node instead of a set of nodes. And there's presumably other capacities we could introduce as well. But I think the key idea that this framework suggests is that all of this could perhaps be unified and organized toward the optimization of the graph matching objective, and then solved potentially using this sort of continuous gradient descent-based partially parallel procedure. Okay, so that's all I had. So yeah, thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions.